This is the last session of the day, and I have a feeling it's going to be a good one. So thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce you to our four panelists that will be speaking today. First, we have Lori Cavender, who's the co-founder of the Washington Host Home Coalition. Kim Reinhart, co-executive director of the Washington Host Home Coalition. Daniel Malone, executive director of the Downtown Emergency Service Center in Seattle, Washington. And I think we should have Sammy Iverson joining us shortly. She is the senior manager of education strategy at Building Changes. I think we'll start off by just having each panelist introduce themselves more in detail, about their agencies and a little bit more about their background. We'll give each of you a chance to answer that. So Lori, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So my name is Lori Cavender, as Jillian said, and I am the founder of Ryan's House for Youth, which is a youth program that serves basic needs, meals, transportation, housing for ages 12 to 24. And during that process, we were one of the first in Washington State to start Host Home program. And from there, it built into creating legislation for the state and then moving into having a coalition as there were more and more host home programs that were arriving on the scene. Kim has one of the most amazing host home programs. She's taken it by far farther than any other program in Washington State, and she is my other half as far as running the coalition.
Thank you, Lori. Kim, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kim Reinhart. I wear a lot of different hats. I'm the executive director of the Mason County Host Program for the last 7 years and change. Lori and I are working together, obviously, on the Host Home Coalition. In my other life, I'm a guardian ad litem and began my career at Child Protective Services. My background has been in social work, and kind of all those things came together for the Host Home project that I'm running currently. But I have a long history in social work in several different counties. I'm also an equity trainer in my other life, and I do nonprofit governance training and crisis management as well. So that's kind of the long and the short of what I do.
Great, Kim, thank you. Daniel, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. Hi, I'm Daniel Malone. I am with an organization in Seattle called DESC, stands for Downtown Emergency Service Center. We are focused on the single adult population of people experiencing homelessness, with a particular emphasis on people with disabilities, especially behavioral health disabilities. We do a variety of different kinds of services for this very vulnerable group, including survival services such as shelters, as well as we're a licensed behavioral health care treatment provider. And those services range from psychiatric street outreach to long-term outpatient psychiatric and substance use disorder treatment services, as well as behavioral health crisis services across King County. And then probably the most substantial thing we do overall is a significant amount of permanent supportive housing, using a housing first approach for the single adult population with the highest needs. We technically serve any adult, so anybody 18 or older, but very few of the people we serve are under age 30, probably 5% or so. So it's a somewhat older subset of people experiencing homelessness than the other panelists are serving. The average age of the people we serve is in the early 50s. Thank you.
Great. And did I see that Sammy joined us?
I am here now. Yes.
Sammy, we are just giving introductions. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and where you're from and your agency.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for your patience and allowing me to arrive a couple minutes late. I was on a call with a school district, a local school district, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of stress going on in those universes at the moment. My name's Sammy Iverson. I work for an organization called Building Changes, based out of Seattle. We do statewide work, really trying to figure out how to build in systems change, how to encourage cross-systems partnership. My particular role as the Senior Manager of Education Strategy, there's also another Senior Manager of Education Strategy. Her name is Marette, but we work together on our Schoolhouse Washington project to really specifically focus on the experience of students experiencing homelessness and or housing instability. As some just kind of pieces of focus, we know that there's around 42,000 students experiencing homelessness in Washington State. We know that 6 out of 10 students experiencing homelessness are students of color. We know that there's a lot of opportunities in cross-systems partnership that could help alleviate a lot of the struggle that we're seeing students have. It is good also to know that our agency is a funder, is not a direct service provider, really leverages and relies on organizations that we partner with and that we fund to give us that ground level insight. From a personal place, I come from homeless housing services and was in direct service positions for about the last 10 years. Also worked 2 years as a McKinney-Vento liaison in the Tacoma Public Schools. So I'm grounded in that work. I care a lot about outcomes for students, and I think that I really truly believe that partnering with community providers is a big answer that has been sadly unexplored in a lot of different ways. Our systems know how to silo well, and I think that we're at a time right now, especially in this pandemic, to think outside of the box around who could be at our table and who could help provide resources and alleviate that crisis most efficiently. So yeah, again, apologies for lateness, and sorry that I missed Lori and Kim's introduction. Secrets out, I might have known them or might know them well and enjoy them thoroughly. So that's out there. Again, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Sammy. Okay, so to start us off, I think one of our first questions would be to maybe explain to us how each of you kind of came into the role that you're serving now. And I'm going to add to that, what in your current role would you say is the most challenging and rewarding part of working in this field? And Sammy, if you want to go ahead and start, that would be great.
The most challenging and rewarding part working in this field?
Yes.
Okay. Was that, this is the award I get for coming in late?
Yes.
Just kidding. No. Gosh. So another thing that I think is valuable to say is I've been in this current role that I'm in with Building Changes for about a year. But like I said, the past 10 years before that were really in direct service. So that's began to shift, but I think the challenges are big and still the same, and they can be understood both from like a micro level up to a macro level. I think what I learned on the ground working with families and students in really vulnerable situations is that we're obsessed with this idea that people choose that. We're really wrapped around this concept of like, there are resources and people just aren't getting to them, when the truth is it has nothing to do with that at all. It has a lot to do with the way our systems are built against those students and families and youth and children. challenging to hear about that continuously happening. When we bring a racial equity lens to it, it gets even more daunting and more nauseating. All of the data that we know that shows that we're not meeting the needs in the way that we could is just literally feels like a weight that you wake up with every day. You know, once you've heard about it, it doesn't really let go. Like, it doesn't let go of you. So constantly battling that, just huge burdens, huge, like, huge buckets of just like, there is no simple solution, right? And you have to work at this from 1,000 different ways, and you have to know that you're not an expert in all areas, or maybe not even an expert at all on some days. But yeah, seeing those constant challenges that people out there are facing, and the crisis that leads to hugely negative impacts. From the student context, it's basically watching things happen to students that take away their access and ability to thrive academically, and we know what that means for future outcomes. So it's like this whole trajectory of, like, when we fail for a young student, like our system kind of continues to fail them through their adulthood. So there's just that lack of responsibility or ability to meet the needs that are so high and that are so hard to see. I think rewarding pieces of this are just like bright spots. It can be bright spots in my day, bright spots in my year. It can be anywhere from, like, a student that I used to work with calling to say, like, I found stable housing and, you know, I'm recovered, and the baby that we were worried about getting taken away is with me and she's thriving. Like, there's micro, like, real life stuff like that. But that's really connected to what it looks like when systems don't fail people. And that gives me hope. Working with really great partners that are passionate and driven and committed to this work, that gives me a lot of hope. Yeah, I'll start us off with those pieces.
Great, thank you. Lori, do you want to go next?
Sure, I had to unmute myself. So I have lived a zillion different lives in a lot of different ways and a lot of different scopes. I think, you know, my biggest challenge was running a small nonprofit that in a small rural community where the community itself, where the lawmakers did not see any need to serve children experiencing homelessness. Their majority of their goals were to serve the adults due to the fact that there was less liability there. And we tried very creatively to find ways to house these young people without being able to afford to have a shelter, without being able to really have larger systems supporting us. And we were able to see some really amazing positive outcomes. Things like young people getting the opportunity to be in relationship with community members to the point that they're staying in their home long term, and that even results in an adoption once they turn 18, so that this young person has a forever family. The positives are the relationships that are built between each other, peers, that they may not have had friends before and support systems, but now they're rooming together in an apartment and they're thriving because they have the support of someone else their own age, and able to really be able to reflect on their lifetime of poverty as well as homeless situations and be able to grow from that. I think that we really need, and this is me standing on my soapbox, but I really think that our priority as community needs to be our children, our young people, because if we do not address homelessness in young people, then it will become something that is a lifelong situation for them. And we will end up with a very large adult population that has never been able to stand on their feet. And so I really think that starting young to address them, even down to early childhood, I think is so vitally important that we put the money and the priority into our children so that then they can climb out of this cycle, whether it's something that their parents put them in or something that they fell into. But no child wants to be homeless. No child wants to live on their own. And so if we can put some priorities around there, then we'll see a lot more positive outcomes, and we'll see a lot of wonderful relationships, not only within themselves, but giving back to their communities.
Great. Thank you, Lori. Kim, you're next.
I wanted to sort of take a second to kind of weave together what all three of my other co-hosts have been saying. So before I came to the host home project that I'm running, I ran a social work business for approximately 25 years for adults. And so I very much vibe with Daniel in those issues connected to that. And in so many ways, that business set me up to understand what happens when children don't receive what they need before they get to folks like me or like Daniel. And so what it did, it was give me a roadmap into kind of how I should look at this business in rural Mason County. So as far as things that are challenging, I think that my approach to dealing with homelessness, whether it's with adult family members that I'm dealing with or the children that I deal with, is really the same. It's an independent living look at it. It's the kind of look that looks at the whole body, the whole life, even in a young child, to try to figure out what things were missed developmentally so we can get to the point of stabilizing housing in a way that's significant. That's a shift for that child. And because, once you stabilize children, that reverb, that vibrates out into the rest of the community as kind of a template for how we try to get to net zero around homelessness. And net zero is one of those like fantasy concepts that systems come up with that just drive me crazy. So I just want to say that, because everybody uses that talk, and I am just like way too black and over 50 to like use language like that as it should actually exist and is functional. So what I will say is that I too want to get to the point where it doesn't exist. But it takes a big shift, because right now we're just talking about housing. So that's one of my biggest frustrations, is that systems are still just talking about housing in many ways. They're not talking about, like, as a whole, they're not talking about mental health, physical health, transportation, finances, hygiene, eating, exercise. They're not talking about a whole human. They're talking about housing. So we all know historically, if you deal with a small piece of that pie, you're not taking care of the whole problem. So that's probably one of my biggest frustrations. And it's not what I do in my business. In my business, we might move a little slower, but we try to look at the whole pie. So when we're figuring out a person, we're not just figuring out housing, we're figuring that out and figuring everything else out to make sure that folks don't return to homelessness, and that becomes a template for whoever comes after me of how we should approach human beings, like they're whole individuals with all these needs, So that's probably one of my biggest frustrations, is that in 2020 systems are still just talking about housing. So there's that. And then I would say that one of the things that I am the happiest about what I do in my job is that I get to work on community partnerships with folks, because honestly, the community partnerships that I have probably expand my dollar, probably double it or triple it that the typical dollar that I spend in the business per child to get to the point of that gets doubled or tripled by amazing community partnerships that do really important work in the community with the students that I work with. Um, and what happens is with that whole body approach is I've never had a student in 7 years return to homelessness. So that's a lot of kids that have been graduated. That's a lot of kids that got stabilized, and not one of them has returned to homelessness. So that to me that's the goal. That's the goal. I think I'll probably fall apart when one does, but that hasn't happened yet. And that's always the goal for me, is like the whole body approach and the whole life approach, um, and the fact that no one's returned to homelessness. And I can just say that it's like the greatest blessing in my life to work with these populations and to be able to use all of my experience to be a tool for them to like have a whole life. So thanks.
Thank you, Kim. Daniel, would you like to add anything?
Sure, thank you. I think the question was just the challenges and hopes of the work. Is that, do I have it, do I remember it right? So, you know, I react very viscerally to that question because this work is extremely difficult. And I think the thing that makes it difficult is the amount of suffering that we see people experiencing. The experience of homelessness is extremely debilitating to people. It harms people in numerous kinds of ways. And it is hard to watch that happen. And when we are in a position to help people, that feels appropriate, like we ought to be helping people, but there is a lot to overcome in terms of the harm that has already occurred to people, and the lack of resource that so many people are faced with. And so that just makes for a line of work that brings with it a lot of, I guess, secondary trauma and just difficulty overall. And so just want to, plainly state that the work is hard in that way. But the kind of things that I think keep me going anyway are that we know what the solutions are. It's not like this is mysterious and we haven't figured out what will work for better lives for people and for a better society overall. We've been able to do work that has proved itself to be the real solution here. It's just that collectively we haven't managed to get our society to bring the resources forward to take it all to scale. But it is extremely gratifying to know that we do know what the solutions are. And the solutions, from my perspective, are housing as the foundation, not the only thing. I think Kim made an interesting point that the talk about housing sometimes leaves out the other things. That's extremely important because we talk about housing first in my line of work with the single adult population. And we don't mean housing only, though. We just mean that people struggle mightily to succeed in things like use of behavioral health care services when they don't have the foundation of a stable place to live to begin with. And so we know that housing works when people have it and are supplied with the support that they need to manage the different affairs in their lives and for them to direct the care that they receive. That all works. And we've been able to see that people with some of the most kind of extreme levels of debilitation and harm that they've experienced in their lives that would be difficult for lots of people in the general public to really imagine being possible, are nevertheless able to have lives that are so much improved over that when given the opportunity to have housing and the kind of daily support that they can direct and make good use of. And so that's the thing to me that makes this work worth doing, and makes me feel something other than hopeless.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm glad you explained that and made that that statement about housing first, that it's not housing only, because I think that is a misunderstanding that a lot of people have. So as housers, people who are on this in this session, we deal with a lot of people who are coming out of homelessness, and we're housing them. And so it's interesting when people say, like Kim, that there's housing, but there's so much more. And for us, housing is what we do. And so what would you say is the best way that a housing authority can serve the homeless community? And Daniel, since you're on, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Okay, great. Well, I think we have got to give people a chance, is the most fundamental thing that different kinds of housers can do. Sometimes people get screened out of the chance to become housed because of concerns about behaviors or incidents that have occurred before, and it's understandable why those kinds of practices are in place. But for me, kind of sometimes the dirty little secret of some of the work is that just giving people a chance is the main thing that allows them to exit homelessness, that they don't come in and realize everybody's worst fears about certain kinds of behaviors. That said, some people do need a lot more support than just the chance to become housed. And so the other thing that I think housing authorities and nonprofit affordable housing organizations and others can do, besides giving people a chance to become housed, is to ensure that they've got the kinds of partnerships for services that people really need in place. And that is probably easier said than done, to put those kinds of things in place. But people who have conditions such as serious mental illness, which is a population that my organization works with primarily, are oftentimes eligible for various kinds of services in the community. And there are organizations that specialize in providing those kinds of services. And so those services that are generally publicly funded ought to be employed in service of keeping people housed. And there are lots of examples of where that's being done successfully. It probably starts with forming the partnerships, but making sure that people understand what their shared interests are in terms of the need to help people succeed here. Nobody wants to have people suffering on the street because they've been rejected from everybody's care. But sometimes one organization's type of care isn't enough for the person. And so when organizations can join forces, they can actually make it work, the housing combined with the services.
All right, Sammy, we'll go to you.
I also worked for a housing authority in 2016 to 2017 for about a year and a half. Tacoma Housing Authority, specifically in what some of you all may be familiar with, the McCarver Special Housing Program. It has a different name now. It has been under redesign, but designed back in 2011. It was a national model on school housing partnership, because the Tacoma Housing Authority made a commitment to offering 50 housing vouchers to McKinney-Vento eligible households in one elementary school as an attempt to stabilize both housing stability and academic outcomes, acknowledging like the vulnerability of that particular school, 100% free and reduced lunch, high needs. So it was, intentional and targeted, and that was the program that I worked in when I worked for the Housing Authority. So just some context. Housing authorities work with so many people. Like, the volume that housing authorities are able to touch is incredible. And I think what comes immediately to mind in referencing housing authorities in this context is, in a lot of contexts in our whole system, we don't take enough time to listen to people accessing our services. I think the same as Daniel's saying around like giving people chances and understanding like there are ways to look at a policy and have it work for people as opposed to work against people. And I think that there is such a high volume of need that that work isn't easy either. So it's also to say like, how do we prioritize listening to those accessing services? How do we listen to stories where on a piece of paper it might not look good, but like when you actually learn who that human is and who their children are, it might look completely different. Like, how do we understand to quantify people in need as humans as opposed to just like the way that their application looks? Thinking about gaps in services, and maybe a housing authority doesn't have the capacity to do it all because none of us do. So like Daniel also mentioned, partnerships, like who's in your community that can be brought in, right, to share the work, to bring in that additional support if, say, you're not an expert at trauma-informed case management, and say you are. I'm not saying that doesn't exist in housing authorities, because I also know that it does, but thinking about those gaps. And then thinking about equity, I think, like, not to go too deep or long about that particular element as it applies to housing authorities, but I think if we wrap our heads around the policies that drive the work, and Tacoma Housing Authority was a moving to work agency as well, so I know that we had a little more flexibility than regular housing authorities, but I would say just keeping in mind that, I mean, we know the overrepresentation of households and people of color in our systems, in our housing systems, in our medical systems, in our education systems. We know that, right? And something that we talk a lot about at Building Changes is this concept of targeted universalism, which is really just a fancy term to say, like, when you serve your most vulnerable the best, it serves everyone. So it's a win for all, and another example that was given to me a long time ago working in Pierce County was an example just physically in the neighborhood, like when you put in a wheelchair ramp, right, it's intended to meet ADA standards, but like it serves strollers and it serves skateboarders and it serves rollerbladers. So like, even if the intent is to serve that person in a wheelchair who has a high vulnerability, like the community is winning from that. So just kind of adopting that type of framework, or thinking about opportunities to focus energy on the most vulnerable, however that's determined, like in your housing authority, and try to kind of get away from that, like, we want to serve all people. I think that is, again, tricky language, but yes, I was excited to share that. It felt like I feel really happy to be able to answer that question for whatever reason. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Sammy. Lori?
So I was really excited that you asked this question. Yay! So as the chairperson of Island County's Housing Authority, I struggle with this all the time. A lot of things need to be changed from the top. A lot of laws need to change. The requirements for housing need to change. We need to be able to be more flexible when someone comes in and their application doesn't look very pretty. Instead of just having to say no, to be able to have the flexibility to say, we've got this spectrum and we can certainly serve you because of X, Y, and Z. Maybe they've got a background that is 50, years old, but we still can't house them because they actually made a mistake back when they were 20 years old or something similar to that. So I would love to see some legislative changes about those applications and how we serve. And then on the other hand, as a person who ran a nonprofit who really took the whole person in mind, we provided meals and transportation and trips to the doctor. We didn't just hand them a business card and say, here, go see this counselor. We literally spent the time engaging with them enough to put them in a vehicle and drive them there, so that if they were anxious or overly concerned about riding public transportation, or the public transportation didn't get them where they needed to go because we live in a rural community and we don't have bus service on the weekends and things like that, how do you then support that person more than just offering them a partnership with someone else? It's really going that extra mile. It's really going and making sure that that person is fed and clothed and able to get to the doctor's appointments. And if they have medication, able to pay for that medication. And if they need to have someone pick up their medication, or, you know, remind them of their medication. All of those things are so vitally important when we look at success rates for housing and for permanency. And we want to make sure that our legislative powers that be are creating these ways that we can do that in those bigger systems and not just in the small nonprofit world.
Thank you, Lori. Kim.
I would say well, first of all, I want to say this. So a housing authority is not set up to meet everybody's needs. So, I mean, let's just be realistic about that. There are percentages associated with every housing authority, and in different places it looks different, but it's a systemic fix. So it's meant to meet a large body. It's not, at this point, meant to be an individual thing. And what I would say is that the idea of that is a daunting idea, that servicing that many folks in whatever county, you know, in a very interpersonal way is a daunting prospect for systems. And not so much because it's that daunting, because regardless of whether they're thinking that they're doing it, they're utilizing partnerships to do it anyway. And so for me, one of the things that I don't love is like this, and I'll go back to what Sammy said about siloing. When you have any entity or any system that is engaging in active siloing that doesn't allow that kind of way to make things more personal, we move away from the human being, and I just don't think it's a good move. So for me, I wish that things could become a little more interpersonal about what the needs of folks are. I think in a lot of ways, you know, bringing in things like coordinated entry is meant to sort of serve that, but it's the same approach. Let's develop another big system to deal with that, right? So it's not like our approaches are really changing. The place that the approach changes is with the folks that are boots on the ground doing this work, right? Because they're invested in a way. They know the names of the folks they're working with. They know if they don't have enough food to eat. They know if they haven't seen a dentist, right? And so we have all of these workers that are doing the most amazing work, boots on the ground. And yet systems is not really catching up with the idea that all this amazing work is being done by these individuals, and that is an individual interpersonal thing. So for me, housing authorities could do a lot, and systems in general, to accommodate what's actually happening versus just bodies that they're trying to serve, you know? And I super understand that the role in government is primarily to serve the masses, right? But it's not working so well. You know, I have a friend here in Tacoma where I live who was homeless once herself and is now well off. And what she's done is bought a lot of properties and refurbished them, and she rents to felons exiting prison, and she rents to them on a pinky swear. She makes beautiful homes that are built like a home that will house 4 or 5 different individuals, that everyone is able to cook, and it is beautiful, and it is the kind of place they deserve to be living in. She rents to them at affordable rates, and the pinky swear is, I'm going to show up once a week. We're all going to talk about everything. You're going to work with your case managers, and you're going to go on to that life that you haven't had yet. So this concept of like being able to change the systemic approach to a more interpersonal approach is what I would like to see. because the current approach is meeting a percentage, but it is not a human approach. And I know some folks don't want to hear that, and that's where I sit on it at this point.
Thank you, Kim. I think that as a lot of us that work in the housing authority field, we do get a lot of pressure from local governments and different advocacy groups. And homelessness is such a complex issue, and there's so many different population, subpopulations within it, whether it's children, homeless veterans, or women and their children fleeing domestic violence. It really is, there's so much. And so we're constantly asked, we really want you to focus on serving individual adults who are chronically homeless. And then now let's serve families, and I'm glad that all of you gave your input on what housing authorities can do in general. Thank you very much for that. So I want to make sure to remind all the participants that are here that if you have questions, please put it in the chat. You can send it to Michael. But there were a couple questions I think someone already answered. Lori, you may have answered one of them. But Daniel, there's a question specifically for you. It says, Daniel, what are some of the challenges you face housing your clients when so many of their cohorts are still on the street? Does it make your client success harder, and how can we change that?
Interesting. Well, yeah, I think the fact that so many people remain on the street makes it challenges the success of those folks who do get the opportunity to become housed in a couple of different ways. One is it commands a lot of resources in the community to deal with all the people who are living outdoors and living temporarily in shelters and so forth. And some of those resources could be used to enhance the support that people moving into housing really need. Sometimes the support that we're able to provide to people isn't quite as much as would be optimal for people. And so I just think that this kind of societal acceptance that some portion of our population are just going to be living outdoors or in other inappropriate, locations makes all this work that much harder. There's also sometimes the kind of particular situations where individual people who move into housing may have relationships with people who are still unhoused, and sometimes there could be issues that come up related to that, of people having visitors in their home that make it difficult for them to manage their affairs properly in the apartment and that kind of thing. But that isn't the main thing, in my view. The main thing is just that housing remains this thing that seems to be held out as either a reward for good behavior, or something that we're just going to provide to people to the extent that we can, but we're not going to really extend ourselves as a society to provide it for everybody. And that inherently makes the whole endeavor that much harder. That it puts providers into this stance of picking and choosing who would be the person they want to house. And it really shouldn't be that way. It ought to be that everybody has an entitlement to housing, kind of like we've managed to do almost with healthcare. And maybe we're not quite there with healthcare, but we're a lot closer to that than we used to be, of making it more of a universal right. And for some reason, we haven't been able to get there with housing, even though nothing is more fundamental to good health than having a decent place to live.
Thank you, Daniel. Lori, I want to go back to something that you said about making it a priority and really focusing on our children. one, let's see, there's a few different funding sources that many housing authorities are a part of. I know communities focus on things like homeless prevention versus rapid rehousing, and then permanent supportive housing. If there was one of those areas to focus on, would you prioritize any of those for that population of families?
So I guess my first comment is that we do prioritize families. What we don't prioritize are those young people that are living on their own. We do not put those young people that are unaccompanied youth in any category of priority. In fact, if you were to talk to the Gates Foundation, which they serve amazingly the families with that have children, they do not serve unaccompanied youth. We have shelters for families in housing authorities. We don't prioritize unaccompanied youth. We say to an unaccompanied youth, you either have the foster care system or you have the option of going home, which for a lot of them isn't even an option. So they end up on the streets by themselves. Then you have issues with schooling and they're not able to go to school. You have issues of hygiene and meals and all of these things with no one there to support them. And young people are afraid of shelters. They have had bad experiences in shelters. And then on top of that, communities, small rural communities, can't afford shelters. So I think that for me personally, as who I am, my advocate is always for those young people that don't have families with them, because at least if there are families out there that are homeless, they have adults in their life. And a lot of those unaccompanied youth don't have any adult in their life to help them navigate. So I think that to first answer that question, that would be my first response. But I think that there are ways that we can increase, and I think Sammy and Kim are best in answering this because they work so well with families with children through their Student Stability Act and all of the supports that they are able to give in those arenas. My arena tends to be the young people that don't have adults with them. So I'm going to kind of push that off onto Kim and Sammy to be able to state, with young people and their parents, what does that look like and how best can we support them?
Kim or Sammy, do you want to go ahead and answer?
Like, Kim, I want you to lead this one.
Okay, I will. So I want to echo very quickly what Lori just said and just say that I don't actually believe that there are systems as defined by HUD or any system for youth that really are dealing with the problem. I think that we're very much in an exploratory phase of how to recognize the problem through language and outcomes, and then B, sort of moving on to establishing a system like the system that works with adults without homes. But we're not there yet. And so I don't think that there is a seat at the table for homeless youth. So I want to echo that, because when we're talking about equity, it's really a huge issue. Like if systems can't establish equity for youth, there's no way then to create a program through language and through legislation to then impact outcomes on those youth. Everything's a domino effect. And I don't believe that we're there yet. So it is hard for me to speak to like what housing authorities should focus on. I think that they're probably the area that they could really, as far as youth goes, not adults, focus on is acknowledging alternative housing programs that are working and working to make sure that they get some of the same sort of resource to impact communities. I think that alternative housing programs are in every community. We don't always know that they're there, but the folks who've been dealing with folks without homes know that they're there and have been utilizing them, but they don't check certain boxes maybe for traditional housing authorities or programs. And so that's the one place I would say for youth. You know, as far as adults, it takes me back to my social work business because I did a lot of work in adults without homes. And boy, I am going to be transparent and say that I understand that a percentage of rapid rehousing is effective and important, especially for adults. Not so much youth, but adults. And I appreciate that there's money there, but I think that there needs to be something a little more that acknowledges, again, I'm going to go back to this, the life of a person. Rapid rehousing is not a fix for me that acknowledges the humanity of a person. It is a temporary fix that doesn't do that. And so for the folks that are working there, I can't even imagine the kind of pressures that you all are under these systems to try to create outcomes every day that are meaningful in the lives of adults, much less children, because I think the heart of the boots on the ground is to create permanent, effective solutions for folks without houses. I think the intent of these programs is to, you know, check some boxes and report back to the feds. And so we just haven't reached that point where I can point at any one program and say, focus on that. Because my concern is not just for the folks that you're housing. My concern is for you folks that are doing this work, that are dealing with programs that you know are partially ineffective, right? So if you're the ones that are holding the resources and dealing with this population and you know that it's not working in the way that you need it to work, I mean, if we're going to start at the root of the problem, we got to give you resources you can actually work with. So I have not answered your question completely, which is not unlike me, because I would rather tell the truth about an issue than give you a pat answer. And so my thing would just, I really think, like, we're holding all these conferences. I would love to see a conference that gathers all of you that work for housing authorities and really puts the power about talking about creations of programs and what your clients actually need, and not have folks who've never been homeless a day in their life and who have values that don't create equal seats at the table designing some of these things. I would really like to see you all designing some of these things, because you're dealing with the real-time impact of poverty and a lack of education and a lack of direction and, you know, misogyny and drug abuse and like all of the things that impact a whole human, right? So again, not an answer, but I feel like if we don't go back to the origins, to the roots of the issue, and work with the people who are actually creating homes for folks, I don't know how from legislators we get answers to these problems. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Kim. I bet Sammy has an answer. So Sammy, you're next.
I love the confidence in that. And I don't. I just think this is a great conversation, and I think that this is a super complex question, really. And if we're thinking about how, I'm trying to remember the initial kickoff when Lori was like, I want Kim and Sammy to respond to this. And I believe it was something around like, how can we best serve youth and families, or adults, youth and adults? Lori, was it in that universe of?
No, it was what should housing authorities focus on?
Okay. Right. Okay. See, I made up my own question.
I like yours better.
Okay. No. Gosh. Sorry, and thank you for Got lost for a minute. I love what Kim has to say. It did make me think about like the different, just the different restrictions that were in place, like when we talk about housing authorities, and like I'm not saying that like all the rules can be broken, because I know that they can't. Like I am, I promise, like aware of that in so many ways. But like it made me think of Tacoma Housing Authority. I know that they just committed to building a gigantic youth campus called Arlington Drive in Tacoma, Washington, that is heavily focused on youth, is prioritizing youth. But what they can do is for youth, 18 and over, in terms of like what their reach is. So what they also did was contract with other youth providers that are able to serve, your 13 to 17. So just like innovation is possible, and that was a community effort. That was not just like, oh, the housing authority made a choice. It was a lot of work. I was not intimately involved in it, but I had pieces of it as I was working in that community. It makes me think of that as a way to look to, a hopeful solution. I also know that their focus was across, like, multi-generational. So just understanding the dynamics of different family makeups, and how that can be supportive both in an equity sense and in a family sense, just allowing people to live the way that they feel works for them, like within, their restrictions or whatever, but being mindful of that. I think that that's a really cool highlight. And I mean, just as again, to know that I'm coming from that student perspective, just to make those cross systems connections. I mean, this interesting conversation that's happening in our chat around like, where are the youth resources? And it's like, some places just aren't as resourced as others, but it's really about thinking about your community and its uniqueness and its needs, and like where the support shows up, and maybe it's not at all. So in that situation, that would be a lot more challenging. But like, schools and districts can be partners, your local boys and girls clubs, your faith communities, like everyone around you can be there to show up for support in a variety of ways. And I think that if I'm like theming kind of the conversations we've had, it's just like, how do you focus on the whole person, the whole child, the whole family, and then the whole community, and acknowledging that that's going to be different everywhere you're at. But I don't know. I think that, like I said, housing authorities serve so many people. One little note that I wrote down when that first question came through is like, making sure that your staff in that grueling work is supported and checked on constantly. I think in those big systems, like I've seen it show up 1,000 times. And like in being transparent, like, burnout is very real and has very real impacts on the people that you're serving. And a lot of that it's not a simple solution to say like, oh, so-and-so just needs to like get over it, or so-and-so just needs to like take a day off. Like, it's bigger than that. We know that burnout happens organizationally, systemically. So just, being mindful of that, making sure like your crew is healthy, and your crew is, able to be present in the work. Because I think that I mean, I've been alongside a lot of families and a lot of students in different big systems, and I'm not saying all are guilty. I'm just saying it's shown up, and that experience can be very different if you're in front of someone that has 40,000 things to do in a day when they can only realistically do 100. So just bringing compassion to that conversation too. No answer.
That was great. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Daniel, I want to bring it back to you and see if you'd be willing to discuss maybe housing first a little bit, and permanent supportive housing. Housing authorities that either are working closely with their continuum of care, or maybe they're just providing housing through their public housing units or a housing choice voucher. We all run into issues where people are coming out of homelessness and they're struggling to stay housed for whatever reason. All of the unique challenges that people coming out of homelessness experience. How do we follow the housing first approach, but still maintain the units, the condition, our policies, neighbors? How would housing authorities really focus on that to make sure that their programs are effective while still maintaining the housing first approach?
Thank you. Well, I will acknowledge that some people can pose challenges in terms of keeping them housed. They may exhibit different kinds of behaviors that are really challenging for the landlord to accept, and so there needs to be additional support brought to folks. My organization has decided that it wants to focus on people with the highest needs and not try to be everything for everybody. We're not serving, for example, a non-disabled population. We're serving people only who have disabling conditions and long-term homelessness. And so we want to be doing this work, and that causes us to have to really specialize in coming up with creative solutions to some of these very difficult individualized cases. For us, the way we work with our public housing authority is primarily through voucher provision. They provide us vouchers that we use for the housing of the people, either in the buildings that we own and operate or in scattered units where we're bringing intensive support services to people in their housing, in the regular marketplace. And that's a good partnership that works well for us, and the Housing Authority needs to be given credit for its participation in that kind of work. I don't think that should be enough to let the Housing Authority off the hook from, needing to extend itself to house in its own housing people who might pose some additional kinds of challenges, because, as I said earlier, it will turn out that some of those folks don't end up posing the kinds of problems in housing that were feared. And then for the ones who do, I'll just be frank and say there needs to be very robust follow-up done. People need a lot. Some people need a lot of support. And sometimes that support has to be delivered more assertively by the savvy service provider. And so it's not always easy for a housing authority or another housing operator who doesn't themselves run their own services to prevail upon community service providers to bring the level of care that somebody is indicating they need. I totally acknowledge that. But that's ultimately the solution, is that people can make good use of housing and be successful in it long term through a combination of A, being given the chance, and B, being provided with an ample amount of support. And sometimes the chance isn't given in the first place, or sometimes the support is not ample. And housing authorities don't always have the ability to turn the service amount into an ample amount. I acknowledge, but I don't know how they change that other than by bringing more resources or by agitating with everyone else for legislatures and others to provide that amount of resource.
Thank you, Daniel. All right, so it looks like we have about 7 or 8 minutes left. So I'm going to open it up to each of you to give kind of your closing remarks and any last thoughts. Daniel, since we're on you want to go ahead?
Okay, sure. Thanks so much for including me in this. I really appreciate it. And it's nice to make some of these connections. I've been part of NARO events in the distant past, and I, just appreciate you all as fellow travelers in this work, even if sometimes I think, I'm out here in this niche work. It's all part of a bigger effort that we're all in together. So I appreciate all of you very much. I'll just relate a short story here, which is that during the pandemic, we had this opportunity at my organization to shift some of the emergency services we're providing, survival services, in shelters, in congregate settings, these places where we bring in lots of people with lots of different needs into environments where they're crowded and they sleep in bunk beds in rooms with lots of other people. And we've never been happy with that environment over the years. But we've accepted it as, better than the street kind of thing, knowing that we needed to house everybody and it was going to take a while to house them. Well, during the pandemic, the opportunity we had was to basically shut those shelters down and move everybody into hotels that were otherwise vacant. And we shifted some of our entire shelter operations to that kind of setting. And the difference has been enormous and immediate in terms of the way people were experiencing being sheltered. It's not housing. It's not the full amenities you would expect somebody to have in housing. And people understand it's temporary. It's not their permanent home, but the improvements people are seeing from just having privacy, your own bathroom, the basic things. They are the kinds of improvements that we know we see when people get housed. We've experienced this over and over again over the years. Housing makes a huge difference in the lives of people who haven't had it, especially who haven't had it for a long time. And being reminded of that by doing shelter in a better way has been maybe the one good thing to come out of this pandemic from my perspective, and the work that we've been doing. And while we know it isn't the ultimate solution, which is housing for the people we serve, it is a reminder that housing is the ultimate solution for everybody. And so just wanted to share that little anecdote about what we've been going through recently.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Lori?
So I was really pleased, that is a great story, Daniel. And, you mentioned respect and privacy and all of those things that are fundamental needs for everybody. And I think that sometimes we forget about that. I think we don't really address who a person is. We look at their application, we get them a place to stay, and we expect that to make huge changes. And I think that the one thing that I have learned that I want to pass on to everyone else is that if you create a relationship with your clients or your participants, however you want to call them, the respect is there. The response is different. If the approach is different, your outcomes are going to be different. And I think that whether we're talking about children or we're talking about adults or we're talking about senior citizens, if we are giving them due respect, if we are looking at the whole person and not looking at them as a name on an application or a number in a queue, I think that then we're going to be able to see changes far greater than we would have ever anticipated. But it really is about seeing that person and engaging with that person in a real way and addressing their needs on an individual basis instead of as one large group. And I will make one shameless plug. Kim and I are going to be doing a little presentation tomorrow about host homes, and that is exactly what host homes are. It is a way to house young people in a respectful way based on relationship. So there you go.
Thank you. How about you, Kim?
So thank you all for having me. I want to say that first. I always am very appreciative of the opportunity to use my voice to talk about humans that need homes. So I very much appreciate this opportunity. I was going to tell just a quick story because I think this is the best evidence. I had a student of mine that graduated 5 years ago, and this was a young man when he came to me, was drug addicted, and he had to go through treatment immediately. And he came from a family, both of his parents were drug addicts. He had been on the street off and on from the time he was 9. And he came to me kind of a hot mess, and he got everything he needed that recognized him as a whole person, and got graduated, and has remained permanently housed. And just this week, he started a fencing business and just landed a $450,000 contract. And so what I want to say is that when you can try to catch some of this stuff with a community fix, meaning many partners, all of us working together to try to address the many needs of a whole human, whether it's a child or it's adult, our impact is just so much greater. And this was a reminder for me that sometimes in my 50-year-old thinking, I get used to a certain amount of like listening to my own limitations instead of expanding the boundaries to not have limitations as a provider. So this was a really good reminder about that, and to try to impact that in any way that I can inside the work that I do. And then I also wanted to like take a moment and literally cheerlead you housing authority folks, because you're doing an amazing job. I think it's never recognized. I know that in the communities that I work in that it's not. And I think it is a tireless job that doesn't really give seats at the table, and you all just keep grinding to try to create opportunity and give people's homes. So I know that my host home project doesn't touch that much, but when I was in my social work business, I was entirely dependent on the work and the labor of you all. And so I just wanted to say thank you. And thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Kim. All right, Sammy, about 30 seconds or less.
Perfect. I love time limits. Thank you for having myself and these amazing colleagues. I think all I want to say is that just the fact this is a space that at this conference where we get to talk about these issues and how to come together to make it easier for vulnerable students and families to access resources, I think that's a huge win. So just thank you for attending. Thank you for building this room for us to all be in. And it was really a pleasure hearing from others today, as well as being in front of you all. And like Kim said, you're doing incredible work.
Thank you so much, Sammy. All right. Thank you again to our panelists. If you guys have questions, their contact information